Hello, everyone. We have some participants coming in as we admit everyone into the meeting. I believe we have approximately 65 folks registered and hoping to get almost that many online. So we'll just give it a minute while folks come online, and then we'll turn it over to Elder Eldon to get us started. We'd like to ask Elder Eldon Bernard to open the meeting in a good way and provide an opening prayer as well as any guidance that you'd like to offer us today, Elder. Over to you. And we'll just have you unmute as well.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm going to say my prayer in my language is the Wolastoqey language from Eastern New Brunswick. The prayer is called Blazweltamawagan. I'm going to say it in my language and in English after. Blazweltamutinetchips Mousawagan. Waliwan chipsidegeg. Waliwan chozamagwan. Modachan Gudawasmil. Waliwan chskiko. Cholamastigano. Waliwan chomidwagan. Woman ligizel to Oknijanak. Waliwan chopizon. Wajigisi pesoltiak. Waliwan cheek. Cho abziak. Wikpiak nagastakno. Waliwan chawaya sizik. Hector to Yanigmo chief. Waliwan chozip sizik. Walitaknawal Lintowagnawal. Waliwan chowizausen. Woman Gizladmotiven. Waliwan chobedagik. Egyptinogamiwan. Wam sigaguli gizigan. Waliwan chogizos. Laat wen maagwen spadel. Nagapli bezogwen. Waliwan choni bauswet. Gibayat wen maagwen. Waliwan chobesazik. Chud laat wessel tidid. Waliwan skitkamik. Chipserigik. Ali waliwan demsil. Let's give thanks for life. Thank you for everything. Thank you for the water, so no one will go thirsty. Thank you for the grass, for the sweet grass. Thank you for the food, for our children will go healthy. Thank you for the medicine so we can heal ourselves. Thank you for the woods, for the trees, the ash, and the evergreen. Thank you for the animals, for they clean the woods. Thank you for the birds, their songs sound good. Thank you for the wind, so we can breathe. Thank you for thunder, it brings us rain, so everything grows good. Thank you for the sun, it brings us light and keeps us warm. Thank you for the moon, it lights up the night. Thank you for the stars, for how they sparkle. Thank you, Earth, for everything that you do for us. That's all. Thank you very much. Have a good meeting.
Thank you, Elder Eldon, and really happy to receive any information or guidance that you'd like to share with us throughout this session as well. Please feel free to chime in. Hi, folks. Welcome to the third impact assessment webinar that the Assembly of First Nations Environment Sector is hosting. This session will be talking about the requirements for impact assessment or environmental effects determinations on federal lands, and the definition of that includes reserve lands as well as those managed by Parks Canada and other protected areas. And the proposals from the Impact Assessment Agency to exempt certain types of projects from those federal effects determination requirements. The first thing that I'd like to do, I'm coming to you from unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory in downtown Ottawa at the Assembly of First Nations office. I also just acknowledge for participants and our federal counterparts as well the passing of Assembly of Manitoba Grand Chief Kathy Merrick. We do understand that there are folks who have been attending funeral arrangements and other gatherings in her honor. And so I think we'll proceed with our meeting today, but also note that there are folks that are otherwise occupied, and we'll share the recording of this session with them, as well as potentially host another session for those who aren't able to make it with us today. Just want to acknowledge Grand Chief and her work as an advocate for her people and community. So thanks for letting me do that. The session is being recorded, like I said, like I mentioned. We're recording the session for note taking. We've been able to work with our IT team to make sure that we have those recordings available to participants and anyone who's not hasn't been able to make it with us in real time. When we do have in-camera sessions, those aren't included in the recordings. And so for the last two sessions, I've updated the calendar invites that participants received with the recording. And so those are accessible to you. We do have closed captioning available for the session as well. And if you're interested in using the closed captioning, the links are available in the chats now. So thanks to the IT folks for putting those up, and the closed captioners for being with us today. We also have translation available. The presentations will be in English, but if anybody needs to or would like to listen in French, you can go to the interpretation button at the bottom and select French. If anyone speaks in French and you're looking for English translation, you can select English translation at the interpretation button as well. But generally, it would be good to keep it on original audio so that you can hear the language that the presenter is speaking. Throughout the webinar, we'll do clarifying questions and any Q&As. If participants want to just raise their hand or put any questions or comments in the chat, I can facilitate those. So I'll be able to see hands. For anything put in the chat, I can speak to it. So it's captured for translation and the recording as well. And the last housekeeping item is just that the materials that are referenced throughout the webinar are available at our microsite for this webinar. And I'm going to put the link to the microsite in the chat now as well. The agenda, a backgrounder, and both presentations that will be referenced throughout the session are already available on that microsite there. So before we turn it over to the folks from the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada and Indigenous Services Canada, just wanted to review kind of the purpose of this webinar series and what we're hoping to hear from federal counterparts as well as participants as well. AFN is mandated by multiple resolutions, but two in particular that I'll put the link in the chat to as well, to share information with First Nations on proposals by the Impact Assessment Agency on new or changes to impact assessment legislation, regulations, and policy, and also call on the Government of Canada to ensure that development or changes to regulation and policy are done in full partnership with First Nations. One of the things that we're doing to achieve that is these webinars as a mechanism to share information on proposed policy and regulatory changes with First Nations participants. The AFN is also in a position to put together technical submissions to, there's two discussion papers on other topics, but also a publication of the Canada Gazette regulation. We are able to collect any recommendations that are made by participants throughout the webinar and submit those. We can also help facilitate further offline conversations between any participants on the webinar and our federal counterparts, as well as a follow-up to this meeting. Today, sorry, I was going to put the link to those two resolutions in the chat. And I think we can get started with the bulk of the material that we'll go through today. We know from the agency that they're looking to make changes to the designated classes of projects order, which is an order that exempts certain projects from federal environmental effects determinations. And there is a draft of a regulation that has been published in Canada Gazette 1 for feedback. But one of the things that we wanted to do and have been able to work towards is making sure that folks have a background on what are the current requirements for environmental effects determinations on what is referred to as federal lands, but includes reserve lands. So we're really happy that our counterparts from the Impact Assessment Agency have invited colleagues from ISK to do some of that background information sharing on the requirements for environmental effects determinations, some examples of projects that do get assessed primarily by ISK on reserve lands, and what the proposals for changes would mean for First Nations. So I think with that, our agenda for today, we're going to go to the agency and ISK representatives. So we have Kevin Blair with us from the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. And Kevin, I'll let you introduce yourself and your ISK colleagues. They're going to walk through a presentation. Throughout the presentation, if participants have questions, feel free to raise your hands or put them in the chat. I can facilitate those. I'll just ask our presenters to pause at the end of each slide so we can check to make sure anyone who does have a question has gotten a chance to ask it. I think we'll try and spend, or it's okay if we spend the bulk of the time together today walking through that presentation, because I do think that it's really important that representatives from First Nations have that background information when we're talking about potential changes. And so if we have time, we can go to an in-camera session. Well, I can facilitate a discussion about any recommendations that folks have, but we'll kind of play it by ear and see how much folks would like to engage with the presentation from our federal counterparts. So with that, Kevin, I think I'll turn to you and let you introduce yourself. And I believe we have one of your colleagues that can share the screen and the presentation as well.
That's right. Great. Thanks very much, Andrea. And yes, my name is Kevin Blair. I'm a manager at the Impact Assessment Agency in our Legislative and Regulatory Affairs Division. And also with me at the agency, before I hand it over to ISK to introduce themselves, I just wanted to note my director, Sarah Jackson, is also joining us today. Marissa Mueller on my team, who's also working on this initiative, is also joining us today. And thank you very much, Rim Gazmi, for sharing the slides today. And then Anna, can I just hand it over to you to start the introductions for ISK folks?
Certainly. Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me here today. My name is Anna Kessler. I am the manager for the Impact Assessment and Environmental Review Process team in Indigenous Services Canada. We're part of the Environment Directorate that is in, it's a headquarters team, and our main job is to support our regional colleagues, the environment officers who interact most closely with First Nations across the country in their review of projects on reserves. So we are trying to make their jobs easier, trying to make our process coordinated and efficient, and add value to the projects that are proposed. So my colleague Yasmin will speak further to that in our presentation. And we also have one of our regional colleagues on the line as well, Jennifer. So I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yasmin. As Anna mentioned, I am an analyst on her team, and I'll be speaking on ISK slides today about our process, how we view the new amendments to the ministerial order, and just, providing as much information as we can. best to provide that context. And we, as you mentioned, we also have our regional colleague from the Atlantic region, Jennifer, who's on the call.
Yes, I'm Jennifer Burley. I'm the team lead in the environment unit in Atlantic, and so I'm supporting Yasmin and Anna on the call today.
That's great. Thank you very much. All right, and thank you everybody for the opportunity to be here today to talk to you about our initiative for amending the designated classes of projects order. And before we move on, I just wanted to say, so that this changes to the order are the focus of our presentation today, and it's related to separate requirements under the Impact Assessment Act for projects on federal lands and outside Canada. So before we get into that, though, we're first going to describe, as Andrea has mentioned, that what is required under the Impact Assessment Act for projects on federal lands, because most people don't necessarily know about them unless you're working in that area, in that domain often, or you encounter it. It's often a bit of a surprise, and so we want to make sure that people understand the context before we then dive into the amendments being proposed for this particular order. So it's great that we have our Indigenous Services Canada colleagues with us here today who live and breathe this on a daily basis. So we'll move to the next slide now. And just to say, again, thinking if when you think of the Impact Assessment Act, you think of very big projects called designated projects that have to go through an impact assessment that's either led by the agency or maybe a panel. You're not alone. This is definitely the most, what most people think of when they think of the Impact Assessment Act. And that's what most of the actual act itself deals with. But for our time together today, I'd ask that you just temporarily forget about big designated projects and the impact assessment process, because what we're talking about today, it's a completely separate part of the Impact Assessment Act. And it deals only with projects, some big, some small, on what we call federal lands, and we'll talk about that in a second. And it only deals with non-designated projects. So nothing that is on what's known as the project list. And there was a session you had a few days ago on the project list. So nothing that's on that list is captured by the process we're going to talk about today. And it's because those are the projects that require a full impact assessment process. The separate part of the Impact Assessment Act that we are talking about, as it says in the slide here, are sections 81 to 91, just those 10 or 11 sections of the IAA, and they establish obligations for what we call federal authorities to determine whether non-designated projects on federal lands or outside Canada, but we'll probably leave that part aside. So federal lands, to see if their projects are likely to cause significant adverse environmental effects. So just to start in terms of breaking things down here, we'll just talk a little bit about what exactly are federal lands. And so basically, federal lands are federal crown lands. And so those can include First Nation reserves, national parks, protected areas, national wildlife areas, national defense lands, and lands also managed by offshore authorities and port and airport authorities. So those are the federal entities that are actually responsible for implementing the parts of the act that we're talking about today for projects on federal lands. All right, if we just go to oh yes, Andrea, you wanted me to stop at each slide, but shall I maybe get through the next slide that just kind of gives some baseline introduction, and then we can stop there?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, thanks. So because these obligations deal with projects that are happening on federal lands, the requirements are aimed at ensuring that the federal government itself considers environmental effects of projects on lands that it manages. So the obligation is on the federal government for projects it's doing on what is referred to as federal lands. So the provisions apply to federal authorities, including federal departments and agencies, crown corporations, port and airport authorities. So it's just important to note that the obligations, they don't fall to the government of Yukon or Northwest Territory or Nunavut, or to any of the provinces for that matter. And also just to note that the obligations don't fall to a band council, for example. It's always the federal department or Crown Corporation, is that federal entity that has the obligation. And the obligations apply to a project if a federal authority is one either doing the project, so they're a proponent of the project, if they're providing financial assistance for a project, or if they're performing some other action. So if they're giving an authorization, or if they have to give a permit that would allow a project on federal lands to proceed, then the obligations outlined in the Act that we'll talk about on the next slide, that they apply to them. So in a case where, for example, a First Nation is doing a project on reserve, they would be the proponent, and a review of the environmental effects, so a determination of environmental effects, would typically be required if the federal government is funding that project or if it's giving a permit for the project. So that would be how this process might apply to a project that a First Nation is pursuing. And on reserve lands, Indigenous Services Canada is indeed the primary federal authority reviewing projects, and that's why we've asked them to be here today. But there are other authorities that may also have to meet requirements if another authority has to give a permit, maybe a Fisheries Act permit, for example, and then DFO might have to be involved in a particular project. So you can have more than one authority that has to meet its obligations under the Impact Assessment Act for the same project. All right, and we'd be going on to the next slide. So, but I'm happy to pause if there are any questions.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Maybe if there's anyone who, any of the participants, if you have any clarifying questions, we'll just pause for a second. Feel free to raise hands or put any questions or comments in the chat, and I can facilitate those. But seeing none now, I think we're good to keep going, Kevin.
Great, thanks. What I'll do, Andrea, is feel free to just jump in and interrupt me. I'll try and pause at the end of slides, but if you want to take a longer pause, then I'm certainly happy to do so. All right, so on this slide, yes, with a little diagram there. So what exactly has to be done for these? There are requirements. What are these requirements? For sections 82 and 83, for those who like to know what section does what under an act. So those sections of the Impact Assessment Act, they set out the main requirement for authorities to determine if projects on federal lands would cause significant adverse environmental effects. So in fact, it's prohibited. So an authority cannot go ahead with a project where they're required to meet these obligations. They can't go ahead with it until they have examined the potential for environmental and adverse environmental effects. Section 84 of the Act, it sets out specific factors that have to be considered in every case. And those are outlined on the right-hand side of the screen here. So impacts to the rights of Indigenous peoples have to be considered, Indigenous knowledge that is provided, community knowledge provided, comments received from the public, and any mitigation measures that are needed to address significant adverse environmental effects of the project. So those are the 5 factors that have to be considered at any time, and other factors can be considered as well. Section 86 sets requirements related to public participation. So notably, authorities are required to post a public notice on the Canadian Impact Assessment Registry, and they're actually required to post 2 notices. The first, before making a determination, they have to post what's called a notice of intent. and that provides information on the project. And they also have to invite the public, including Indigenous peoples, to provide comments regarding their determination. And then no sooner than 30 days after that posting of the notice of intent, so that's a minimum, they can wait much longer if they want, they would post a notice of determination. So including any mitigation measures taken into account for the determination. So some projects are actually, we'll get into this, are actually very, very small. And so sometimes those, the time between the two notices is fairly short, around 30 to 60 days, but it can be much, much longer as an authority takes time to examine the environmental effects and engage with Indigenous peoples and the public, and then make their decision, make their determination is sort of the language we use in the Act. And just to note that authorities, they have the discretion to establish their own environmental effects determination process. ISK is going to describe a bit about theirs in a minute. And for its part, IAC, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, does not oversee the determination process, but we do provide support to authorities on the requirements of the Act, about sharing guidance and best practices, and the agency also, Impact Assessment Agency also hosts the registry where the notices are posted. All right, and then on the next slide, we have just, or show a little bit about the registry. There we go. So it's just a screenshot of the registry where authorities have to post their information. So it's the same registry for those of you who have looked up designated projects and engaged in those processes through the registry. It's the same registry. And you can find projects there that are on federal lands. And so it's there that the notices of intent and determination would be posted. So this is a helpful resource to see what sorts of projects are happening in your community and to identify the point of contact at the authority leading the project, and that person can be contacted to learn more information and to submit comments or concerns about a project. And so we do have just a little screenshot there on the left, so you can see what it looks like, and we do have the URL on the screen as well. And then on the right-hand side here, there are just a few examples of the types of projects that are happening on federal lands that are also on the registry. So you can see there's a housing development, which is basically a residential subdivision project, including land grading and access roads and installing septic tanks and culverts and all those kinds of things. So that's I think a fairly typical kind of project that might happen on federal lands where these requirements under the Impact Assessment Act might be required. Also, new telecommunication towers. So in this case, it was a 120-foot tall telecommunication tower. And I should note, yes. So ISK was the authority for that first project. So we've got Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada was an authority for the second one. And then the third example is just of a water system. So it's a water treatment system. And that one ISK was an authority. So it's kind of a range. There's a huge range of projects that can happen on federal lands. And most of them would trigger what we call triggering a requirement to look at the environmental effects through this determination process under the Impact Assessment Act. Yes, and so just a reminder. So in all of these cases, an authority is required to undertake a determination because, one, they're on federal lands. They have a physical project where they're kind of building something, and the federal government has an action or a decision to take, so a permit or funding, or they're actually undertaking the project themselves. And then briefly, on the next slide, just to give people a sense of how many projects actually happen. So we have basically about 1,000 projects a year on federal lands that are posted and requiring a determination that we've been talking about. So about 1,000 a year. Most of the projects are related to buildings and property, ports and harbor, water management, and then a whole variety of other types. So parking lots, gardens, docks, telecom, cables and towers, and that kind of stuff. And then just to outline on the slide that it's actually about 5 authorities that are responsible for about 3/4 of the determinations that take place. So Indigenous Services Canada is right at the top of the list there with about 1/4 of projects. Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Parks Canada, DND, and Transport Canada. And so now, actually, what I'll do is I will hand it over to ISK, I think Yasmin probably, to go over. They have a few slides before we get into the ministerial exclusion order, sort of the main topic of the day.
I think maybe before we do that,
Sure.
that's great. So I see the point there that 5 authorities are responsible for 75% of determination processes. And I don't know if it was in this deck, but I think at one point we had talked about the number of federal authorities. So how many federal authorities are potentially responsible for environmental effects determinations? And it is quite a few. I'm wondering if you could speak to the range of federal authorities that do environmental effects determinations in general. And perhaps it's a question for our ISK counterparts, if there's any particular reason why Indigenous Services Canada does do a bulk of the environmental effects determinations. Because that's really an interesting statistic that 25% of environmental effects determinations are made by ISK. So maybe I'll just ask you to speak to those 2 points, and then there's also a question in the chat that I can read out after.
Okay. Sure, thanks for that. And so there are I think it's over 70 authorities that sort of is actually set out, of course, through the Act, what entities are sort of considered to be authorities. So, and when you break it all down, it comes out to about, it's just over 70 actual entities. So there are a lot of Crown corporations, for example, a lot of departments, and a lot of others who fall into that category. So then, in terms of the number that are actually, that's a great question, and I don't know the specific answer, but looking at the registry, certainly have these top 5, and then I would say there are it's probably about 25 or 30 who are regularly posting online, not to say that others aren't on occasion. So there are, I suppose depending on how you look at it, it's relatively few or a lot. So, but anyway, so there are a number of authorities who have obligations and are conducting these on a regular basis. And then and I can, certainly leave it to, or certainly let ISK talk about why they think they're so often have to be an authority. But I suppose it could be a factor of just the area, the number of First Nation reserves in terms of the amount of land and the number of projects that are actually happening on those lands. And Indigenous Services Canada is the land manager for those lands, so they often have obligations related to those. But I don't know if ISK wants to jump in there.
Basically, Kevin is on point with that, with the amount of reserve lands across the countries, and the amount of activity on reserve lands. We are more involved than other types of federal authorities, as we also, because we have many funding programs that First Nations can apply for when developing projects, and that's another reason why we are the authority. we are the authority that does the most amount of determinations for federal lands projects. Yes.
Thank you. So there's two questions in the chat. I'm going to read the first and then we'll go to the second after. I believe it's Roseanne asked, is Atomic Energy Canada Limited included? And apologies, I don't know enough about that particular situation. I'm not sure if that's as an authority or as a project that requires a federal environmental effects determination. Kevin or folks from ISK, do you have any information there?
Sure, yes. And so Atomic Energy Canada Limited is an authority that has obligations for making determinations on federal lands projects when they're involved. Yes, and just to note there, if it's helpful, people might see when they look at those projects, AECL works with or has an agreement with it's Canada Nuclear Labs, CNL. And so you may see their name on projects that ultimately in AECL, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, has to make the decision for, but it is AECL that has to make the decision. They have the obligation. But just a little footnote to note there, but yes, they are an authority.
So they're an authority that would have responsibilities to do environmental effects determinations on lands that they manage. Thank you.
Yes.
So there's another question in the chat. What role do affected communities play in the environmental effects determination?
Thank you for that question. And I wonder if we could, because I think ISK's next few slides are actually going to cover that off nicely. So maybe we could park that and then they could follow up if there's anything else they wanted to know.
Yeah, that's a great idea. There is one other question in the chat that I think is in the same on the same topic. So how do you engage Indigenous peoples and communities in the process in contexts where there might be overlapping claims or shared jurisdiction? So I think maybe we'll ask our ISK colleagues to address those two questions as they're making their way through the next few slides as well. Thank you.
Yes, for sure. And our next couple of slides will, or I hope, address those questions. And if not, we can answer them again after presenting those slides. So I'll just, right. So we call it's called a section 80, even though it's sections 81 to 91, we continuously use the words section 82 determination. So our section 82 determination is called the environmental review process. And this process was established back in 2013, 2014 in collaboration with First Nations and Indigenous communities when SIA 2012 came into force. Since the coming into force of the Impact Assessment Act, we have updated the process to reflect the new regulations. I'd also like to mention that we are in a phase of reform with the intention to improve the overall process at the internal level within ISK, but also at the external level as well, trying to make the process more efficient and predictable for proponents and First Nations as we work together to get projects approved and developed in the best way possible. So, and we call the environmental review process ERP for short, so I'll just be referring our process as ERP from now on. So the ERP is designed to be a project planning tool, enabling the considerations of possible significant environmental effects of proposed projects and the impact of those effects on the health, social, and economic conditions in communities. ISK is responsible for analyzing the environmental effects before it can issue funding or any other type of authorizations in support of projects on reserve lands. The way in which we might get involved in a project is if we're the proponent, if we're providing some financial assistance, for example, through our funding programs, or if we're issuing a permit, some type of lease or license as well. So that's how we're triggered. The ERP, so the main focus of the ERP is to support the identification of mitigation measures and best management practices that may eliminate or reduce the environmental effects of proposed projects. The overall process, our process, consists of 5 steps. So the first one is determine if the ERP applies. Then we identify the level of environmental review required for the project. We analyze the environmental effects. We consider those Section 84 factors that Kevin went over. And then we make our decision and the implementation process of the project. And to begin the process, the proponent is advised to fill out and submit sections 1 and 2 of our project description form for the ISK Regional Environment Specialist to review. The project description form collects information about the project scope and the surrounding environment, which allows the environment specialist to determine if the project needs to be reviewed by ISK. Does it meet the definition of a project under the IAA, and are we supporting the project in any way? If so, can it be exempt under the ministerial exclusion order? If not, then we take a closer look at the potential environmental effects of the project and identify mitigation measures and best practices. Many small scale or routine projects supported by ISK are considered to have very low or negligible environmental risks because they have usually well understood, predictable environmental effects that can be managed with standard best practices, or they fall under the ministerial order. And in that case, we don't have to do a complete full review of the project. Many of the types of projects that ISK reviews include community infrastructure projects, so usually roads, bridges, water, wastewater infrastructure projects, schools, health centers, offices, child and family services buildings as well. Also includes economic development projects, and that includes gas stations, business centers, commercial parks. We've also been noticing an increase in renewable energy projects for projects on reserve, and that usually includes wind or solar farms. I'll leave it at that. I'll just let the audience know that we have links within the slide that bring you to our form or to our webpage if you want more information on our process overall. Our webpage has our proponent's guide on there, and that kind of outlines in detail how we conduct our business for each step and how the proponent and First Nation is involved in that. So that's very helpful too. If you want to go and read more, those links are available for you, and you can take a look at our form as well. I mentioned in the beginning, but we are in the process of reforming the ERP and identifying ways to improve it at the internal and external level. We're also in the process of identifying improvements as it relates to coordinating with other departments that may become involved in the project. So for example, if a project is being funded through another department's funding program, but ISK is still triggered, let's say for a timber permit, both departments would coordinate and collaborate on reviewing the project with that one project, one review principle that we try to uphold. In our form, the proponent, if known, could identify if another department is to be involved in the project. But either way, if known or not known by the proponent, at the internal level, we verify if the project does trigger another department's, ideally early on in the process to avoid unnecessary delays. I'd also like to point out that in situations where ISK is not triggered and therefore is not obligated to review the project, the First Nation can adopt our process as their own if that is something they wish to do. Our process functions as a service we can provide when requested. I'd just like to, I'll leave it at that. If there's any questions,
Thanks, Jasmine. So thanks for the note that ISK is in the process of reviewing the ERP right now. Is there an opportunity for folks on the call or anyone else interested with experience in ISK's ERP process to provide recommendations for that review? And is there any particular way to do that?
If there aren't any questions or recommendations now, you can definitely, we have our contact information at the end of this presentation, and you can contact us at headquarters. The email is provided, or you can contact directly your regional environment office. for any specific questions on projects that I may not be able to answer, but for the overall process or policy wise, definitely reach out to headquarters. I'm more than welcome to hear everything and anything you have to say on our process.
That's great. Thank you. I think the next slide is a kind of flowchart image about the ERP, but maybe I'll ask you to just skip ahead to the slide on First Nations involvement in the ERP and speak to the two questions that were in the chat, because we want to make sure to answer the questions that folks are asking. So I'll just ask Rim to go to the next slide, First Nations involvement in the ERP. And I'll just note too, so I think the questions were, what role do affected communities play in the environmental effects determination? I interpret this question to mean like both ISK's ERP process on reserve lands, but also how are First Nations consulted or engaged if there's an environmental effects review and determination process, perhaps that's made by a different federal authority, let's say Parks Canada or a port authority, that could potentially impact local First Nations. So maybe get you to speak to both of those contexts if you're able to.
Yeah, sure. So what role do affected communities play in environmental effects determination? Well, part of our process, part of the review process, is to make sure that communities are not negatively affected by the project. Our environment specialists will go out to the community and engage and collect the information that is provided to us to make sure that the communities and their health and social economic situations are not negatively affected. Also, in our form, we do have sections dedicated to outlining if there is a possibility that this project may negatively affect, or if there has been already community knowledge collected by the proponent. So that is something we ask in our form as well. But the environment specialist will, double check and make an effort to collect that information outside of the form. I don't know, Jennifer, you want to add anything to that from regional experience, but that is the main ways we work with communities to make sure that the projects don't negatively affect them.
Was it
Yeah.
Jennifer? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's exactly kind of what we do. Like, I know in Atlantic, our projects are very small, that's community infrastructure. So often, like, it might be part of the community plan or a land use plan as well. So, we review those and they're just implementing those plans, and we're just ensuring there's no environmental effects. So yeah, no, that's mostly like how we engage with community to kind of get that information.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just read the second question as well, and then we can, if there's any other questions that folks have, feel free to just raise your hand or put them in the chat. But I think the second one was about overlapping claims or shared jurisdictions. So say there's First Nations with like neighboring First Nations with overlapping claims regarding rights or title, or shared assertions of authority and jurisdiction, and a environmental effects determination is triggered for any kinds of projects on any federal lands. Perhaps it's on reserve, but not. How does ISK engage with those First Nations in those situations?
So most of our projects are very small in scale, so it is rare that it will, the project may have effects outside of the reserve land itself or in other jurisdictions. But in the cases where that might happen, we do consult and engage with those potentially affected communities outside of where the project scope is happening. It's our duty. That is something that we definitely take into account for larger projects. it's the same process, but at a larger scale. And the consultation period obviously will take much longer to engage with everyone and make sure that nothing will negatively affect them. I know the Atlantic region it is mainly smaller projects. I think in BC is where we see the most amount of those larger complex projects that are becoming more popular. But it is something that we definitely do. We consult and engage with all possibly affected communities outside of the initial reserve land, sure.
If I can just add a little bit to that, I think through the environmental review process, as we learn about kind of the extent of where effects might happen, we would be consistently turning our minds to what nations may have rights and interests in those lands, and taking a proactive approach and ensuring that they are aware of this project that is happening, and making sure that they have an opportunity to share any concerns, to understand what the potential effects will be, and then taking those into consideration. When there are multiple departments involved, so on reserve, but there are several authorities, we definitely try to coordinate with other federal authorities as well to make sure that we're not each going out on our own and asking the same questions and contributing to that consultation fatigue. In the case where it'd be other federal lands, and ISK doesn't have kind of that trigger formally, other federal departments can come to us for expertise, and in that case, we might be providing information, making sure that they're aware of other communities that might be affected, their interest in lands, where there might be project effects, and then making sure they have whether it's contact information, whatever it is, to make sure that those authorities can contact. So we might not be triggered, we might not have a determination to make, but we can provide support to departments who do.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat. At what point in the ISK process does the review team consider environmental laws or regulations passed or permits issued by Indigenous communities themselves?
That is something we consider at the very beginning of the project. When the information is collected in the form, we ask if there are any other either federal authority permits or laws and regulations involved, let's say Species at Risk or Fisheries Act, that may come into effect. But we also ask if there are Indigenous permits, regulations also on that relates to that land. Yeah, that is something we do consider for sure. And that's probably something we see more often when it comes to FNLM nations, who can and do issue those types of permits.
Thanks. And I'll just add as a follow-up. So then what happens if there are those, if First Nations have adopted their own Indigenous laws or permits for their reserve lands? What happens to the process, the ISK's ERP process, and how are those First Nations laws upheld and implemented?
Right. So usually in those cases, we become triggered due to a funding trigger, and not necessarily a permit or authorization trigger, because that is something that's up to the Indigenous or the First Nation. So in that case, we're still obligated to make a Section 82 determination. However, if the First Nation has their own EA process, we would, default to theirs while still, maintaining our responsibilities under the Act. And usually in those cases, First Nations would hire a consultant to do the work. So we'd work with the consultant to harmonize, work with them to make sure that all our responsibilities and requirements are met in a certain way, but that still fulfills that, the consultant's work and what they've been charged to do. So yeah, we work with the community we work more with the community in situations like that, and the consultant that they hire as well.
Thank you. Are there any other questions that participants wanted to ask about ISK's ERP at this point, because I think the next portion of the presentation will focus on the ministerial exclusion order and proposals for exemptions from the requirements for federal effects determinations. So I think this is an opportunity to provide any feedback or recommendations or clarifying questions about ISK's environmental review process. So maybe we'll just give it a minute for folks if they wanted to put their hand up or put any questions in the chat.
No problem.
Okay, so seeing none at this point, that's okay, that's great. Want to provide the opportunity, and Yasmin, I think you mentioned that your contact information is included at the end of the presentation. So if folks wanted to reach out with any kind of feedback or recommendations on the ISK's ERP process to inform that review that they're doing, I think it's open to folks to do that as well. I do see one other question in the chat. So what prevents an interested or impacted party from using the ISK ERP as an appeal mechanism after being disappointed or not agreeing with a First Nations environmental assessment process?
Maybe Anna can speak to this. This is something I haven't personally encountered, but or maybe Jennifer, if this is something that she's encountered, she can speak to this specifically.
Just I appreciate your patience with me as I digest the question to make sure that I'm answering the right thing. I'm wondering, Andrea, can you ask if the question asker can provide just a little bit more context? I think that would help us
Sure.
understand specifically their concerns.
Sure. Michael, are you interested in unmuting and speaking to your question? Is there a particular situation that you've encountered that you'd like to speak to?
Sure. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah. I was just thank you for that. I know it's so difficult to try to get all the ideas into a question as you're trying to type feverishly. I was just wondering, because noting in the information on the screen that ISC will always, in any particular context, default to a First Nation EA process, and rightly so, of course, while still monitoring to ensure that all of their various IAA responsibilities are covered off. But that triggered in my mind the idea that if someone is not happy with any given First Nation EA process, determination, or outcome or decision, it could they then turn to ISC and attempt to engage ISC's process as an effective appeal on the earlier decision by a First Nation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I can see where your concern is arising from. I think, given that we wouldn't want to run kind of that duplicate process, if we were opting into using a First Nations environmental assessment process as a way of informing our determination, then ultimately that determination that ISK has to make at the end around significant environmental effects would stand. There isn't really an appeal process for people to opt into in that regard. But we do have the factors that we need to consider, which would include any public comments, community knowledge, Indigenous knowledge that others might bring into the process. So if we received comments that disagreed with the content or the conclusions of the First Nations environmental assessment, I think it would be ISK's responsibility to consider those and kind of document what our rationale was in considering them and how they affected the Section 82 determination we have to make. But this would be, the same would apply to comments in support of the First Nations EA process. It's not really a formal way to to appeal once a determination has been made. I don't know, Kevin, if you've experienced this type of tensions in with other departments that might be able to give a more well-rounded answer to Michael.
Thanks, and I'm sorry, I don't know of a specific situation where this has applied, and I guess it would depend on whether, if the First Nation EA process, if that is sort of legally under the impact assessment, if that replaced, or basically if it meant there was no need to make a determination under the Impact Assessment Act, then the IAA determination process wouldn't exist, I guess. So there wouldn't be an opportunity to look. I know there are cases where there are sometimes, so maybe not in ISK's process, but in other cases where the First Nation process would run, and there remains an obligation under the Impact Assessment Act to make a determination on environmental effects. So there it might be complementary, or it might be an additional opportunity to flag concerns about environmental effects in that case. But it's not something that I'm aware of necessarily happening often.
Sorry, I started talking and I was still muted. Talking for a little too long. I think I should have noticed beforehand. Okay, so there's another comment in the chat. To confirm, would a First Nations environmental assessment process replace or only inform the federal authorities process?
In situations where the First Nation has their own EA process, we would default to theirs. So we wouldn't conduct our process separate from theirs. We'd work with them within their process and then use the information that they're collecting along with information that we have on hand as well to inform, I guess, both processes. But we really want that one project, one review principle to be upheld. It's for both sides. It's more efficient. It gets things done faster. We avoid unnecessary delays, which can also be costly for the First Nation as well. So we really try to make it as easy as possible and harmonize both processes. So they feed each other in a way.
Thank you. And maybe I'll just ask, and I suppose the answer is probably it depends on the situation, but for somebody who's living on a reserve close to a project, who is potentially concerned about the environmental effects of that project, whether the proponent is the band council or someone else, what is the actual mechanism to receive, say, a notice that there's this environmental review process happening and an opportunity to provide comment, whether it be Indigenous knowledge about potential environmental impacts or other just concerns?
So in cases, Kevin mentioned this earlier, but we do post project information on the registry, unless they are on that ministerial exclusion order. And in that case, we do not need to post. But in cases where they don't meet that ministerial exclusion order list, we do post on the registry. We do conduct a full review. And by posting on the registry and having that minimum 30-day public comment period, people can go there to provide their feedback or any concerns they may have about the project. I know in certain situations, or maybe in more than we're aware of, the band council may post the project on their website, on the community's website, to get feedback that way as well. And also, on the registry, there's also a contact information. So if you do want to speak directly or contact directly our environment office, our regional environment office, you can contact them as well. more directly in that way rather than the registry.
Thank you. I wonder how many people are aware about the registry and the notices that get posted on there. Do you often get community members who engage with postings on the registry about ISK ERPs?
I have to say that it's pretty low when we don't get much public comments on the projects we post. There have been cases where we'll see the extreme and we'll get 500 comments for one project, and usually those are the bigger projects with more unknown environmental effects and where there's more concern. But most of the time, it's a very low number of comments we get on our projects. And usually these projects that we do support, it's for the benefit of the community. It's like health centers, hospitals or band offices or art centers, schools, sports centers, stuff like that. So usually it's seen in a positive light, although we won't ignore that there's possible environmental effects, specific to probably species at risk that may be involved or maybe on the land. And that is something we always take into account. We always look into and review for projects.
Thank you. Is there any other questions or comments that folks wanted to raise their hand and unmute to or put in the chat as well? I'll just note a comment in the chat asking, would it be possible to receive the link to the registry? So I did put the link to the registry in the chat there. I think at one point, folks from the agency were offering training on how to use the impact assessment registry. I think when it was new under the new act. I wonder, Kevin, do you know if that's still the case where folks could reach out to on like an overview on how to use the registry if they're interested?
Thanks for that question. I assume they're providing something on the registry. I would have to check. And for those who want to, if you go to the Impact Assessment Agency website, actually, if you go to that link that Andrea had posted on the Canadian Impact Assessment Registry, you'll find contact information there, and you can contact the registry team about training, or they may have information. Let's see. There's a tutorial video available on their actual registry site. And there's an ability to receive email notifications on different updates and things like that. So you can subscribe to those things, but you can also reach out to the registry team, and I'd be happy to try and facilitate that as much as possible. Just trying to think if there's something, comment on a request profile. Sorry. There is
Just
an about us. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, while you're finding that in the contact information, I'll just note for folks too, there is a way through the registry to sign up to receive notices about certain types of projects. So you could sign up to receive notices about environmental effects determinations that ISK is reviewing, I believe. So I think I receive weekly emails with updates on when documents or entries are updated on the registry to get notices about when things are changing. And Kevin, if you're able to find any contact information in the chat or any information. Oh, there we go. So the registry contact information is in the chat now. Thank you, Kevin.
I may have actually just sent it to you, and how it was close. I wasn't sure about sending it to everybody. So sorry, Andrea, I've just sent it to you. Please do copy and paste it over to everybody.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. And there's another question in the chat as well. So if the projects are excluded, so I suppose on the ministerial exclusion order, and therefore not posted on the registry, how can First Nations or members of the public provide comment?
I wonder on this. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, no, go ahead. I guess I just wondered if we go through we maybe talk about what the ministerial order is, so the exclusions, why there are exclusions, if we went through that first for some context, and then could talk about it, but I'll be quiet now, and if Isk wants to speak to that, go right ahead.
Sure. Maybe, Yasmin, if you had anything that you wanted to add on this portion. Otherwise, we can move on to the ministerial exclusion order. And Kevin, I think you'll be able to speak to that question.
Yeah, I'll just say very quickly that because it's excluded, we don't need to post on the registry. So it would, like, we're not obligated. But that doesn't mean that we wouldn't want to know or engage with the community to hear their thoughts. And our environment specialists, they're involved in the community more than just reviewing projects. They're also there to assess contaminated sites, solid waste initiatives. So they're more familiar with the community. They understand the community plans, land use plans, anything that might be of concern for the community. So there's constant engagement there at the regional level.
That's great. Thank you, Yasmin. Okay, Kevin, I think we're good to go to the ministerial exclusion order section, so we can proceed there.
Great. Thank you very much. And yes, so we've spent a bunch of time on the context about federal lands and projects on federal lands and what they are. And now there's a piece of the puzzle here in terms of when a determination is required. And it's related to, it's a regulation. It's actually an order that's can be created by the Minister of Environment. So we call it the Ministerial Exclusion Order, and amendments are being proposed on it. So that's kind of the main reason why we're here today to talk about those. And there's an opportunity to provide comments and feedback on the proposed amendments. So just to the next slide there, please. Thank you. And so this order, and I'll talk about what it is and everything. It's called the Designated Classes of Projects Order, and we commonly refer to it as the Ministerial Exclusion Order because it is the minister who has the power to create this order under the Impact Assessment Act. And what it does is it excludes classes of projects, so types of projects, from requiring an environmental effects determination if they will cause only insignificant adverse environmental effects. And that's the authority that the minister has. It's written right into the act about there has to be only insignificant environmental effects. So this order, it already exists. The current order came into force in 2019. And then just to recap, so that in the world of federal lands under the Impact Assessment Act, the federal government is by default required to conduct an environmental effects determination on its projects on federal lands unless it is specifically excluded through this order. And that happens by being listed, the type of project being listed under this order. So why exclude? Why would you exclude a project if it means you're not going to be looking at the potential environmental effects? So because of the nature, you're in until you're out. Without the ministerial exclusion order, an effects determination would be required for even the smallest projects, like changing a light bulb inside a building, touching up paint on the outside of a building, or maybe making small repairs to a fence. So as a way to avoid, I think, wasting effort and resources evaluating projects that would be very unlikely to cause any kind of important environmental effect, this order allows projects with extremely low risk of environmental effects, otherwise referred to as insignificant effects, from requiring a determination under the IAA about its environmental effects. So that's what it does. And the ministerial order has the following structure, and I feel it's important to relay how the whole order works, because it starts out with something we call general limiting conditions. So regardless of the type of project you might be looking at, These conditions provide overarching environmental protection to water, migratory birds, species at risk, archaeological areas and artifacts, and a bunch of other things as well. So even if a project is actually listed on the order, projects aren't eligible, they're not eligible for exclusion if they don't meet these initial conditions. So basically it's a hurdle that you'd have to get over and you'd have to get past before before an authority is able to look and consider whether its project is excluded from the requirements to make a determination. And I think that's important because, of course, where things are located is important. So if you're proposing to build something in the middle of a parking lot, that's very different from asking to build something in the middle of a wetland, for example. So, and then after that, the current order is divided into two schedules. And the first applies to basically all federal lands except those run by Parks Canada. So things like national parks and national historic sites. And the second applies to those Parks Canada lands. And the reason that the Parks Canada lands are separated is they're generally more sensitive. And so those exclusions are tailored to what is generally included on parkland. And the current schedule lists about 50 projects, and it includes a range of things, including small buildings, lighting systems, fences, and telecommunication lines. But these are all things, and we'll get into this more, these are all things that are considered straightforward, routine projects with very standard mitigation understood to deal with really any type of effect. And then moving to the next slide, just for a bit of context. I'll just wait for the slide to come up. Great. This is just because it can be confusing when we're talking about the ministerial exclusion order and projects on federal lands. People may sometimes be thinking about the project list for designated projects under the Impact Assessment Act. So this diagram is trying to show that, so on the right-hand side, you have the project list with designated projects, and those are that have the largest potential for adverse effects within federal jurisdiction. And then over on the left-hand side at this point, so we're trying to show diminishing sort of potential adverse effects getting smaller and smaller. At this point here, you have what would be called insignificant effects, the lowest of the low. And that's the world that the ministerial exclusion order works in. And again, it's only for non-designated projects. And then in the middle, you have all the federal lands determination processes that have to happen. So say the 1,000 a year that actually happen. So it's really over on this left-hand side with projects only that have insignificant effects that we're talking about in terms of the ministerial order. Okay, so that's a bit of an introduction to the ministerial order, and then our next slide is actually for ISK to talk about some of the examples of exclusions that are relevant on reserve.
Yeah, so with the projected widened scope of project classes and footprint thresholds that are to be included in the ministerial order, that means more projects may be approved in an expedite manner. To be sure of a project exemption, however, ISK requests that proponents still fill out section 1 and 2 of our form. It's still important that project proposals be submitted even if suspected of an exemption, since the responsibility falls on ISK, but we also can provide valuable information to support the project, like mitigation measures, sustainability measures, location of contaminated sites, let's say. So that's why we still ask for the first 2 sections of our form to be completed and submitted to us. Some examples of current exempt projects that we see more regularly, that includes building renovations that do not necessarily increase the footprint of the building, individual housing projects, utility lines along roadways like small cell towers or hydroelectric cables, water and wastewater upgrades, as well as small solar projects. So that includes charging stations and building upgrades for those solar projects. So these are the type of projects that we currently see that can get exempt from a full review if, as Kevin mentioned, they meet those limiting conditions that he went over. Are there any questions for the slide?
Don't be shy, folks. If anybody wants to ask about current exemptions for the requirements for ISK's environmental review process, you can put your hand up or put it in the chat. Yasmina, as you were talking, I was wondering if ISK has considered how the environmental review process and what's currently exempted and what's proposed to be exempted interact with source water protection zones and the proposed bill. I believe it's C-61 on First Nations drinking water. Has there been any work done on considering how requirements or exemptions would protect source water?
To my knowledge, I haven't heard of our process. Like we're aware of that bill, obviously, but our process, we would ensure that it wouldn't affect that or come into conflict with it for sure. Even with the new exemptions, I believe one of those limiting conditions is that it doesn't affect was it
I'll jump
groundwater
in.
and regular like running water? Yeah, sure.
I'll jump in. Yes, so currently the order. So one of those general exclusions is anything that could affect or change a characteristic of a water body. So it's very broad, and we'll talk a little bit about some slight adjustments. But so anything that could affect directly or indirectly the characteristic of a water body, anything about a water body, its quality, its water quality, the quantity of water, anything can't be excluded. So you'd have to go through a determination process.
Thank you, Kevin. So sorry, let me just restate that. So even if a project would otherwise be exempt because it meets the description in the ministerial exclusion order, if it would change the characteristics of a water body, then it's not exempted. And then there's a proposal to slightly change that broad exclusion. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And I would say we'll tweak it. And we do have a slide. It's dedicated to this change in terms of water quality. But yes, currently the order is you cannot be excluded if you're making any change to a characteristic of a water body. So changing water in any way, you can't be excluded, even if a type of project is listed on the elsewhere in the order. Doesn't matter. Can't be excluded.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Perhaps I'll move to the next slide. Great. Thank you. And so that's what the ministerial exclusion order is. And so now talk a little bit about the amendments and why we're proposing to amend the order. So basically, experience so far has shown that of the thousands of projects that are undergoing effects determinations, some of them cause only insignificant adverse environmental effects. And that is the main reason we're making amendments to the ministerial exclusion order. And it's basically to address some key gaps and help improve process efficiency, only for extremely low risk projects, and that'll enable government resources to be directed to where there's greater value. but specifically and consistent with the approach that was taken for the current ministerial exclusion order, classes of projects had to meet very strict criteria to be considered for exclusion. First, there was a preliminary screening to ensure new classes of projects were simple and had limited interaction with the environment. And folks, so we had authorities, so that all the authorities who are obligated to do these assessments, and they're the ones who are who know their types of projects. They provided some proposals. So the agency did not, come up with its own, but we did want to hear from authorities about exclusions that they thought would be reasonable to add. So we carefully researched those proposals. So those, we had, first it was they had to be simple, had to have limited interaction with the environment. So that was, some things were not considered further from that point. Then further research was undertaken on those remaining, and we consulted with expert departments like ECCC and others to understand the environmental effects at play. And finally, as we outlined here on the slide, we used 5 standard criteria. They're significance criteria to evaluate the significance of each project's potential adverse environmental effects. So what we're trying to show in the slide here is that in order to be considered insignificant, the effect had to score in the lowest category across all of the standard significance criteria. So those shown in blue on this slide. So in other words, each effect from a project had to have a negligible magnitude, have a very small spatial extent. It had to be infrequent and short in duration and be highly reversible. So only projects that could meet all of those criteria, and where each effect had to meet all of those criteria, only those were considered for exclusion. And then in the next slide, we'll just get into some of the proposed amendments to just try to provide a bit of an overview there. So first of all, there's a new title. So we're changing the title from Designated Classes of Projects Order to Order designating certain excluded classes of projects. It's still a mouthful, but we're hoping that it helps further differentiate the order from the project list, which talks about designated projects, and to help clarify that the order identifies project classes that are excluded from requirements under the IAA. So that's one of the main changes. But also we've added a schedule. You may recall I talked about there's a main schedule for most federal lands. There's a schedule for Parks Canada lands. And now it's proposed that there would be a third schedule for national wildlife areas. So currently, no projects that happen on national wildlife areas can be excluded. And ECCC advised us that there are a few things that they can do, a few undertakings, activities, and projects that would only have insignificant environmental effects. So the amendments allow exclusion of a small set of very low risk projects, including building trails, installing smaller buildings on developed land already, and repairing power lines. So those kinds of things could happen in national wildlife areas based on the amendments. And then going to the next slide, just to get into a few other amendments, and these are the proposed amendments on our general limiting conditions. So again, these are the conditions even before looking at the project type. You have to meet these conditions to be considered for exclusion. We are proposing some changes to the exclusion related to water bodies. So instead of just any characteristic of a water body, there are proposed changes to the limiting condition. So we would specify that there can be no changes to the water level, to the alignment of a water course, or any characteristic of a wetland, And also another general limiting condition is that there cannot be a release of any deleterious substance. So with those pieces, I think there would be very limited ability to do things that affect water. But because you can't affect the water level, you can't change the alignment of a water body, you can't release any kind of deleterious substance, and you can't change any characteristic of a wetland. So we're still trying to afford a large amount of protection for water. And then the only other one I wanted to mention is we've also added a condition that you can't be excluded if there are any activities happening in marine protected areas that are prohibited. So it's just to confirm that things in marine protected areas can't be excluded.
Can I ask one question before you move on, Kevin? Just what is the mechanism for follow-up? So if a project proponent submits a ERP form with a project description, and it says that there won't be any change to water level, alignment of water course, or characteristics of a wetland, and so the project is exempt from the requirements, but then in the course of doing the project or the construction, there is impacts to water. What is the mechanism for follow-up?
So thanks for that question. And I don't know, in terms of specific, I don't know if ISK wants to jump in here, but basically, so it's not the proponent doesn't get to decide. It is the obligation of the federal department, so the authority that's involved. So if we're on First Nation reserve, let's make an assumption that it would be ISK. So ISK would be responsible for, basically in this case, sorry, it was a great question, and I just want to clarify that. So that's why the things on the ministerial exclusion order are extremely specific and are basically the lowest, have the lowest potential for environmental effect. So, and all of our evaluation would be done, is being done ahead of time in terms of these amendments to make sure that anything that could be on the list would not result in something that that would be an important environmental effect. So with that being said, if during the course of a project there was concern, a community member would really need to reach out to the federal authority. So in the case, it would probably be ISK to say, I'm concerned about this project here, because if it's excluded, it should be, and if this is the thing, we're talking about sort of theoretical, I suppose, but these things are really very small. So you could have a small building on already developed land, and land cannot, for example, it can't have contaminated soil. That cannot be involved, and there are a number of other conditions that are set out under the ministerial exclusion order. So I think the follow-up would be reaching out to the land manager. So often in this case, it would be ISK to connect on potential concerns about a project. But what we're focused on and aiming for and working towards, and I think the existing order supports this, is that the things that are considered, that are included on the order and that are allowed to be exempt are very small routine projects where there wouldn't be an important environmental effect.
Thanks, Kevin. And I see Anna came into view. So Anna, did you want to speak to this? And maybe I'll clarify or just ask another question for you to clarify as well. If the project is on the ministerial exclusion order, does a proponent need to fill out your ERP form at all and provide notice to ISK about the project? But again, maybe you could answer the second part of the question as well.
Yeah, Yeah, so I think situations like this are another reason why filling out those first couple sections of the project description form is really helpful. And make sure that we're aware of the project, that we know that we have that double check of like, yes, it is excluded. And then maybe some awareness of, kind of where that line is. If it's close to the line of being excluded or not, we might be able to pay it kind of like additional attention. Or we could identify early on some mitigation measures for the project that would keep it on the excluded side. Also, the program, so in addition to kind of community members noticing, or in good faith the proponent identifying us, if there was a program that was funding the project, it would also be responsible for making sure that that it was in compliance with the requirements of the Act. And if it switched from being excluded to not, that program would also then bring in the environment officer at the time and figure out, okay, what level of environmental review is warranted. So our environment and land folks would be involved, but then it could be, if it was an infrastructure group that was funding the project, they'd be able to tweak to those restrictions as well.
Thank you, Anna. Kevin, did you want to go to the next slide? Maybe in the interest of time, we'll try and get through a couple more of the slides, and then we can facilitate some more Q&A.
Sure, and we are almost done. I think we have 4 more slides to go through, and so this next one it describes some of the other amendments. And then, just so folks know, on the following slide we will get to just a few concrete examples, and then Isk is also going to talk about some of the sort of what this means for projects on reserve lands. So to have some more context and grounding there, but just to take people through a few highlights of things that are being proposed in the amendments. Some new classes have been added. So one, we're calling it sort of a catch-all class, and that's for structures that are no larger than 25 square meters, and that's about the size of a one-car garage. And basically it's impossible to list all kinds of very, very small things that could be excluded. So this entry could be used for things like flower planters is a thing that would be a project on federal lands, installing flower planters, installing garbage cans, installing benches, for example. So all of these could be, as long as they're not being proposed in for example, a wetland or something like that, they could be excluded. So we also have a catch-all class for things that are in water, so in water structures, but those would have to be no larger than 10 square meters, and there are a series of limiting conditions that would also have to be met. A few other things. So navigational aids for air and marine transportation. So it could be some small lighthouses or radar sites, underground petroleum storage tanks, up to 5,000 liters, but there has to be no contaminated soil for that to be allowed. And also we've added low voltage electrical transmission lines within existing right-of-ways, which basically they're already allowed there are some exemptions for telecommunication lines. So we've added low voltage electrical transmission lines since the impacts are largely the same. And then there are some amendments to existing things as well, to existing exemptions as well. One of them is for buildings for well-known purposes like houses and hospitals, recreation centers, or schools on developed land. And I think this is often, these are often the types of projects that are undertaken on First Nation reserve lands. We've increased the threshold for exclusions from 1,000 square meters to 1,500 square meters. Given just how well understood the potential impacts are for these types of building construction projects on developed land. And that doesn't mean that a whole building complex could be excluded. It's just an individual building that we're talking about here. And there are some amendments related to expansions in general. Basically, the current order, it unfortunately it can have an unintended consequence of encouraging new build instead of small expansions to, say, an existing building. So we basically are allowing expansions up to a threshold of 1,000 square meters, which is the threshold for any new building anyway. So that hopefully will encourage just expansions of buildings instead of building something completely new. And also there are some increases to thresholds for modifying or changing existing utility infrastructure, so water pipelines and sewers and things like that. So allowing for modifications to those things or removing them, for example, those are proposed for exemption as well. And then just to try to hopefully help people picture this in their minds a bit more, there are some examples of projects that are currently on the registry that all these reviews have been completed already. But going forward, if the amendments were to proceed, these types of projects could be excluded. Of course, it always depends on the location and the characteristics of the site. But for example, the first one here is a roof replacement for an office building. So that type of project could very well be excluded based on the amendments. We have a revitalization project of a cultural space. So
Sorry, Kevin.
Yeah.
Just to interject,
Please
Brim,
do.
do you mind going to the next slide? Sorry, we just hadn't changed the slides.
Oh, I'm very sorry, and I forgot
That's okay.
I forgot to say that.
That's
Yes,
okay.
and I'm going to jump in. I do see that there's a comment about small nuclear storage. So there's nothing nuclear. Nuclear is not something that can be excluded at all. So you don't have to think about that in terms of exclusion. Right. So a cultural space, for example. So in that case, we have an exclusion about modifying buildings. So that could be excluded. We have the Muscopetting Powwow Arbor. This is an interesting one. We have it included because it's, if you take the area, so the square meterage of what's proposed here, I guess I think it's a circular building and it's 45 meters, I think, in diameter. I think technically this is just above the threshold. So for anyone out there who knows of this project, it's close to that, something just a bit smaller, but something less than 1,500 square meters could be excluded. So this type of project, as long as it's below the threshold, could be excluded. And then this last one, for example, this C-bin installation, it's actually a floating garbage bin that skims the surface of the water. So it doesn't interact with the water, the seabed or anything like that. So this type of project could probably be excluded under its Part 1, and it's one of these catch-all classes. It's a project smaller than 10 square meters in water. So I hope that gives at least some grounding in terms of the types of things that we're talking about here. And I will pass it over to Indigenous Services Canada for the next slide related to this too.
I think Yasmin had a little bit of technical difficulty. So I'm just going to pause a moment and see if she was able to join.
Yeah, I'm back.
Good.
Sorry about that. Right. So based on past projects that we normally post on the registry, the ministerial order amendments would allow for even more projects now to be exempted from a full review. And these types of projects that I have listed here on the slide are the ones ISK sees more often, and with the increased footprint thresholds, more of these projects can be exempted from a full review and approval process can be expedited. So some noticeable changes that are noticeable to us as a department includes the increased footprint threshold for building expansions by 1,000 meters squared on developed land and 100 meters squared on undeveloped land, the increased footprint thresholds for special purpose buildings to 1,500 meters squared on developed land and 500 meters squared for undeveloped land, and that includes residential accommodations as well as hospitals, health centers, schools, fire, paramedic, and police stations, arts, culture, religion, spiritual, sports centers as well. And also the increased footprint thresholds for water pipelines. And that is related to also the modification, the decommissioning, removing, replacing within that existing footprint of up to 1,000 meters. That would have a significant difference on the way we review projects. As well as the increased footprint threshold for telecommunication lines and the new class for electrical transmission lines. And that includes building new or lengthening to 100 meters in length and the modifying, removal, replacement, and decommissioning up to 1,000 meters. So these are some of the amendments that we've noticed that would impact the amount of projects that we do not need to post on the registry, do not need to go through that minimum 30-day public comment period, do not need to go through a full review, and can get developed quicker, and the whole process can be expedited. Any questions on this slide?
I see one in
also
the
like
chat.
sorry.
I do see one question in the chat. So could one proponent implement multiple small storage petroleum tanks on their property, or would this be flagged as needing further follow-up?
Right, so thank you for the question. And so the way the ministerial order is structured is that it's a single project. So what is listed on the ministerial order has to describe the whole project. So in this case, if there were multiple small storage petroleum tanks, it wouldn't be excluded. I suppose if the limit is 5, so it's up to 5,000 liters, and I don't know the smallest possible storage tank. I suppose if it was 2 that were 50 liters each, I suppose that's maybe would still be within the threshold, but I think the storage tanks are generally of that larger size. So doing more than one means you would not be excluded, and you would have to conduct, the authority would have to conduct an environmental effects determination, because there would be no exclusion in that case. And I think it's an important point to flag again, I'll reiterate, is that what's outlined in the order needs to describe the whole project. So as I was saying, you may be able to exclude a whole building or a whole house being built, but if you have a housing project that also involves sidewalks and maybe some parking lots and maybe some roads, that is not eligible for exclusion because it's not listed specifically in the ministerial order.
Thank you.
Great. So, and I am aware of time, so I do want to just maybe get to the next slide here, which is a very important one on how to participate. So we have the text of the amendments is currently posted on Canada Gazette Part 1. It's on their website there, and it's available. It was posted on July 27th for a 75-day public comment period. And so comments are welcome until October 10th. And we definitely welcome feedback on the proposed amendments. So we'd be very interested to hear if there are particular changes that people think, no, this would not, would be concerned about this kind of addition or change. We definitely want to hear that. There's also further information on that Canada Gazette Part 1 website. There's what's called a regulatory impact analysis statement, and that describes in plainer language what the proposed changes are, as well as having the actual regulatory text to comment on. So the Canada Gazette website, it has built-in commenting features to share your feedback. You can provide them anonymously or with your name attached, and the comments won't be visible publicly until the end of the comment period, and that we've been able to verify them to make sure there's no private information included or anything like that. And I do want to note that comments have to be provided using this online system. And it's actually all related to free trade agreements that we have with other countries. Apparently, it does require that comments on regulatory initiatives and some other things that they have to be public. And so we are bound by it. So even if we do receive comments directly, say by email, we will have to follow up and ask people to post them. And if not, then it creates some challenges in terms of them being considered official comments. So hopefully everyone is comfortable with using the commenting platform to provide their comments. And we definitely would welcome any and all comments that people have. Once the comment period has closed, we'll review and consider all the feedback, and we'll plan to publish finalized amendments in Canada Gazette Part 2 in winter of 2025. And that is the end of the presentation. I know there are on the slides, you'll find there's some additional information about ISK's triggers, and ISK has some contact information as well on the last slide too.
That's great. Thank you, Kevin. Is there anyone that wanted to ask any clarifying questions of the presentation so far? And I'll just ask, Kevin, do you mind putting your email address in the chat as well? Because I see that it's not listed on the slide here.
Sure.
Or any direct contact information for folks at the agency who can be responsive to recommendations on the ministerial exclusion order itself. And would encourage webinar participants to look at the link that I put in the chat to Gazette, where the draft regulation is posted. And we always do advocate for flexibility in receiving comments from First Nations representatives, and hope that the agency, if folks aren't comfortable or familiar with the online platform, to receive comments by email, and just work with reps to make sure that somebody from the agency is able to walk folks through how to use that online form and potentially help to do it for them. With that, I think if there's no kind of clarifying questions at this point, we'd invite webinar participants to follow up with the agency and ISK counterparts. And would really like to thank you folks for your attendance and contribution in the presentations that you've given today. I do think that it's really helpful information for participants. I do see one comment in the chat: if a First Nation prefers sending a written submission instead of filling out the Gazette comments, what email address should a nation be submitting these comments to? I believe that would be Kevin and your team. Is there contact information you can put in the chat for everyone?
So we can definitely, we'll definitely provide, it's our regulatory inbox. However, I do want to stress, and we will work with nations that want to provide or are concerned about providing comments online. We are bound by the requirement to have, and it is certainly, I think, an exception. In many other cases, we would say, please just send us your comments by email. In this case, we are bound by having all of the comments being available online through specifically the Canada Gazette platform. So I would say, and if people do send us, we've been in comments, for example, we've been instructed that we need to ask them to please post them on Canada Gazette Part 1. There is a mechanism where people have to sign a privacy agreement, if not, so there can be a way for us to facilitate that, but I think it could be more straightforward, I guess, if people did that directly. I would say there is a place for just general comments, and If people preferred to just put all of their comments there, sort of copy paste, that would be just fine. And we'll get them, and we'll see what parts of the amendments, for example, that it might apply to, there versus, you know, finding a specific section and making a comment on it. We'd be happy to do that as well. We'd also be happy to receive the written comments in addition to something that has already been submitted online. That would be fine. But we do need to make sure that those comments get onto the Canada Gazette site in order to be considered. But we'll work with communities as much as needed to help facilitate that.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, any contact information that you could put in the chat to help facilitate would be great. There is one other question. Is this requirement for all 3 of the IAC proposals for which comment periods are open? And Sarah answered in the chat. No, there has been discussion papers released regarding the project list and the Indigenous co-administration regulation policy approach, and comments to those can be provided in writing in response to the discussion paper directly to the agency representatives who are listed on those discussion papers, and also through the online forum as well. And Sarah put some more information in the chat, so thank you for that, Sarah. Okay, thank you, folks. And I think with that, we'll turn the webinar over to Elder Eldon for closing, and any other reflections that you wanted to offer us today, Elder, and just thank the agency and ISK folks for their participation on the webinar today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, everybody, for their presentations. I just want to say a lot of information, good information, and it should be passed right across the country. Thank you. I want to say my prayer in my language, the Holistic Way language. It's called the Lord's Prayer. Gallows it imiagan. Mitoksen spamkigain. Kamach kichit pisquizuan. Mejmenek nikanabek sin danelibuadman. Mejmenek is like skit kamidalo spamkig. Melina bemkis kok the bunman. Onheltemi aklak mixwag no mo. Delo in utikis wabluin danion elibuadman. Bejo kaminis the woli beji out you nawin. Samigis nikanaginson, the getch, negas camille, little age. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation. You are the most powerful and the holiest, now and forever. Amen. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you, Elder. Thank you, everyone. Take care.